The sky above Perdition Ridge hung low and swollen, a bruise on the edge of bursting. Thunder murmured over the far mesas, and the wind carried the copper tang of a coming storm through the narrow streets of the town. Lanterns flickered behind dirt-smudged windows. No one lingered outside, not with the gallows built and the hanging set for dawn. Inside the jailhouse, the woman sat chained to the iron ring bolted into the floor. Her wrists were rubbed raw. Her dark dress, once plain but proud, now hung loose over her frame like the shadow of someone else's life. She stared through the barred window, without blinking. The clouds hadn't split yet, but her eyes had the calm of someone watching lightning approach. She hadn't spoken in 2 days. Not since the trial, if one could call it that. For witnesses, one drunken lawyer, a dead boy, and a preacher's wrath had been all it took to seal her fate. Sheriff Dawson watched her from his desk across the room, chewing a toothpick with a kind of slowness that meant he was thinking harder than he let on. He was a wiry man, near 60, gray in beard and backbone both. The badge on his chest wasn't polished, and neither was his conscience. "You hungry?" he asked. The woman said nothing, just shifted her eyes from the window to him, then back again. "You'll die empty," he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. "But maybe that's what you want." The storm cracked outside, distant but closing. Dawson crossed the room, filled her tin cup with water from the pitcher, and slid it across the floor. She didn't touch it. Her gaze remained locked on something invisible just beyond the glass, like she was listening for footsteps only she could hear. Across town in the saloon, a whisper ran between card players and whiskey-soaked drifters like wildfire through dry brush. A man was coming. A name spoken only in half-sentences and superstitions. They say he rides a black horse with eyes like coal fire. They say he once gunned down 6 bounty hunters at once, didn't reload. They say he's not a man at all, but the ghost of every outlaw hung without a prayer. One man swore he saw him years ago in Santa Fe, dressed in a black duster that fluttered even without wind. Another claimed he'd fought beside him in the border wars and lived only because the gunslinger had spared him wordless. No one knew why he'd come to Perdition Ridge, but the tale of the woman waiting for the noose had reached every poker table between here and El Paso, and stories like hers had a way of attracting men who didn't believe in mercy, but didn't much care for justice, either. Back in the cell, the woman closed her eyes. Her breaths were slow, steady. The kind of calm only those who'd faced worse than death could wear like armor. She didn't flinch when the storm burst overhead, nor when the front door of the jail creaked open. Dawson turned from his seat. His hand hovered over his revolver, but it was more habit than threat. The man in the doorway was soaked to the bone, hat brim dripping, boots caked in red mud. He stepped inside without a word, his presence pressing against the room like a second storm. His coat dripped water onto the wood floor, but his face was dry, cold, weathered. "Can I help you?" Dawson asked, but he already knew better. The man didn't answer, just stared past him, to the cell, to her. Her eyes opened slowly. No shock, no fear, just quiet, soul-deep recognition. Dawson moved to block the view. "You'll want to come back tomorrow. She hangs at first light. Law's the law." The man tilted his head, then stepped further into the room. A low rasp of boots on floorboards. One hand unhooked his coat, revealing the handle of a silver-plated revolver. He didn't reach for it. Didn't need to. He looked at the sheriff, finally speaking in a voice low and level. "She's my bride." Dawson scoffed. "You're 2 years too late for that story." The man's eyes, gray like smoke over winter ash, didn't blink. "Married under tribal right. Santa Fe territory. You got a problem with that?" The sheriff paused. Tribal marriages were hard to prove, harder to refute, and legal on paper anyway. But Perdition Ridge didn't put much stock in paper. The woman in the cell rose slowly, chains clinking. Her posture changed, not hope exactly, but something closer to defiance. A light behind her eyes stirred from long dormancy. Dawson exhaled through his nose. "Even if that's true, she's set to hang for murder. You can't just walk in here and claim her. She was never given the law," the gunslinger said. "Just a verdict. I'm giving her a choice. Choice, the sheriff echoed. She walks with me, or she dies for you. But she chooses. That's more than you gave her. Outside, the storm deepened. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the walls like 1,000 fists. The wind carried the first scent of desert, sage crushed under hooves. The woman stepped forward. The chains yanked at her ankles, but she didn't stumble. She stood in front of the bars, eyes on the stranger. She didn't smile, but her voice, when it came, was roughened velvet. Why now? He didn't answer, just reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he drew a bone pendant strung with sinew cord, worn, stained, unmistakable. He held it up. Dawson looked between them. He didn't understand the language written in their silence, but he saw enough to know it was real. You walk out that door, he said, and the town's going to come for you both. You know that. I do. And you're willing to die for her? The man's eyes never left hers. I already did. In the long silence that followed, only the rain spoke. Then the sheriff stepped aside. He didn't nod, didn't speak, just moved out of the way. The man walked to the cell, unlatched the door. The woman stepped forward, and when she reached him, she touched the pendant, just once, before letting her fingers fall away. He took her hand, and together, they stepped into the storm. Behind them, the gallows stood silent in the dark, waiting. But not for her. Not tonight. The storm had turned the dirt roads of Perdition Ridge into veins of black mud by morning. The wind still snarled through the eaves like a caged animal, and the gallows, so carefully built, stood unused, its rope dangling like a question no one wanted to answer. The gunslinger and the woman had holed up in the old livery barn on the south edge of town. It was half collapsed and smelled of horses long gone. But the roof held, and the shadows were thick enough to hide them, for now. He crouched near the open door, revolver resting on his knee, eyes scanning the town through gaps in the wood. She sat against a bale of hay, rubbing her raw wrists. A blanket draped her shoulders, stolen from the sheriff's cot during their escape. She hadn't spoken since they fled. He hadn't asked her to. They sat with the silence like a third companion, heavy and familiar. When she finally broke it, her voice was dry. You still don't have a name. He turned slightly, just enough that the early gray light caught the scar that ran from his ear to the curve of his jaw. I gave it up, he said. Didn't suit me anymore. She studied him, as if piecing something together from the angles of his face and the quiet between words. You lied about being my husband. No, he said, slow and certain. I just said it before you could say no. Her eyes narrowed. Not in anger, something else. Calculation, maybe. Memory. You could have left me. Let me hang. You weren't there when they came. I was too late. His voice dropped. I found your trail cold. Spent a year chasing ghosts, another 6 months drinking with them. You didn't answer my question. He looked at her then, fully. The sharp lines of his face were worn by distance and violence, but his gaze held steady. I didn't lie. She shifted, the chain still clipped to her ankles, rattling softly. We weren't married. No. But I remember the way you looked at me that night, and it was closer to a vow than anything I've ever known. She looked away, blinking once, slow. He stood, stepped toward her. The pendant he'd shown the sheriff, the crude bone charm, hung from his belt now. He untied it, held it out. Take it back. She hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers brushed his. When she took the charm, she held it like something fragile, not worn by blood and time. Outside, the church bell rang once. That's not a good sound, he muttered. She stood, the blanket falling to the floor. That bell rings when someone's dead. A beat passed. Or when they want to warn the living. They slipped from the barn through the back, past the broken fence, and into the alley between the butcher's shop and the general store. The town had roused like a wounded dog, slow and mean. Men with rifles paced the boardwalk. One of them, a farmhand turned deputy, shouted when he saw them. They didn't run. The gunslinger's revolver was already in his hand. The man didn't finish his warning before a bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him to the dirt. Within seconds, the church steps filled with townsfolk, and at the front of them stood the preacher, his white collar stained with sweat, his Bible gripped like a hammer. His face had the cold fury of a man who traded grief for vengeance and called it righteous. "She's guilty," he shouted to the crowd. "You all saw her shackled. You all heard the truth. And now you let her walk free with the devil's hand around hers." The woman stepped forward, the pendant still clutched in her palm. "I told the truth," she said, voice low but firm. "You just didn't listen." The preacher's eyes burned. "You murdered my son. I protected someone he would have ruined." That brought murmurs. Confusion rippled through the crowd. No one had heard this before, not during the trial, not after. Her defense had been silence. It landed louder than any plea. The preacher stepped down a single stair. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your boy wasn't innocent." Her voice trembled, but she didn't falter. "He followed a child, barefoot, half-starved, into the canyon. She didn't speak your language, didn't know what he wanted. But I did. I stopped him." A woman in the crowd gasped. Another man muttered a curse. The preacher's knuckles went white around the Bible. "You expect us to believe that lie?" "She buried the child's name to protect her," the gunslinger said, stepping beside her. "The girl lives. Somewhere far from here. But she lives." The preacher's eyes darted to the sheriff, who had just arrived, boots thudding down the walkway. Dawson looked older than yesterday, shoulders hunched, mustache heavy with rain. "She's speaking now," the sheriff said. "Wasn't allowed to before. That changes things." The preacher stepped forward, face twisted. "The law is the law." "No," Dawson said quietly. "Justice is." The preacher raised his hand like a blade. "She hangs. By dawn or by blood." And the mob began to stir. The gunslinger pulled the woman behind him. "Go east," he whispered. "Now." She didn't move. "No. I'll draw them off. You won't survive." "I'm not trying to." She grabbed his coat, fist tight. "Then don't make me survive you." A single shot rang out. One of the townsfolk had fired too early or too scared. The bullet struck the dirt near their feet. Then the air filled with thunder again, not from the sky, but from rifles, pistols, panic screams. The gunslinger returned fire, precise and cold. Dawson ducked behind a barrel, returning shots just high enough to wound, not kill. He was buying them time. The woman grabbed the fallen deputy's spare revolver. Her hand shook, but her aim was steady. She fired once, then again. Together, they cut a path toward the edge of town, bullets grazing wood and flesh alike. The preacher screamed after them, blood on his collar, but his voice was drowned by the storm and the roar of gunfire. When they reached the last fence before the prairie, the gunslinger turned back, eyes meeting Dawson's. The sheriff gave a single nod, grim, final. The gunslinger nodded in return. Then he and the woman vanished into the rain. Behind them, Perdition Ridge burned. Not in flame, but in fury, in questions, in the kind of truth that couldn't be buried, even beneath gallows and mud. They didn't speak for miles. When they finally stopped to rest beneath a line of cottonwoods, her voice broke the quiet. "You didn't have to come back." "I didn't," he said. "I just never really left." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Above them, the clouds began to part, just enough to let the stars peer through, like eyes watching two shadows ride into land too wild to tame. They rode until the horses staggered, muscles trembling beneath sweat-slick hides. The high country greeted them with silence, a ridge of red rock and brittle brush, where even the wind seemed cautious. The gunslinger dismounted first, boots sinking into gravel. The woman slid off her mare and landed harder than she meant to. Pain flashed across her face, but she didn't speak of it. The injury from the jailbreak had worsened. A jagged gash across her side bled through her shirt. She wrapped it tighter, with a strip torn from the hem of her dress, teeth clenched against the sting. He watched her from beneath the brim of his hat, not offering pity, just attention, the kind that paid close mind to weakness without calling it out. "We'll rest here," he said. "Long enough to stop the bleeding. Maybe longer." She sat against a slanted boulder and let the sky hang heavy above her. Stars spilled across it like scattered salt, uncaring and cold. She pressed her hand to her wound and winced. You always run toward gunfire? She asked. He shrugged. Only when it's yours. She let out a dry laugh, then coughed. The sound wasn't far from weeping. He handed her a flask, and she drank. The burn steadied her, gave her the strength to look at him, without armor. You had a life, she said. Somewhere. Why burn for mine? I didn't burn anything, he said. That life was already ash. She looked at him a long time, then leaned her head back against a stone. So you came chasing ghosts. I came chasing you. The words weren't romantic. They landed like truth, flat and irreversible. I don't deserve saving, she said, barely more than a whisper. He didn't argue. Instead, he crouched and began building a fire. The rocks crackled with heat as it caught. Orange light danced across their faces, softening nothing. After a time, she pulled the pendant from around her neck, the crude one he'd given her years ago in a darker canyon than this, and turned it over in her hands. You remember that night? I remember the quiet more than anything, he said. The kind that didn't feel like loneliness. She nodded, slow. You left before morning. I thought it would make it easier. It didn't. They sat in silence again, fire crackling between them. Crickets murmured in the distance. Coyotes howled far off, where the land dropped into a narrow valley. Then she said, almost too quietly, the girl's name was Ahia. I don't know if she's alive now. I got her to the border, to a trader who spoke her tongue. That was 4 years ago. Maybe 5. You saved her. I killed to do it. You saved her, he repeated. She looked down. The preacher's boy, he was laughing. When he grabbed her. Like it was a game. His jaw tightened. He wasn't a boy. He was a man with power who thought himself untouchable. I stabbed him. I didn't stop after the first blow. Or the second. She breathed in. That part one don't regret. He didn't flinch. Most nights, she continued, I dream of the blood. Not because it haunts me. Because it felt like justice, and that scares me more. He tossed another branch into the fire. Justice is just the name folks give to the version of truth they like best. She looked at him, something raw flickering behind her eyes. What's yours? He hesitated, then sat beside her, close but not touching. Mine died the night I shot my brother. He'd murdered 2 men in cold blood, took a woman from their wagon, and sold her off like livestock. I rode 3 days to catch him. He begged. I didn't listen. You did what had to be done. No, he said. I did what no one else would. That's not the same. The firelight painted his face in harsh shadows. For a moment, he looked ancient, carved by regret and desert wind. We don't walk away clean, she said. No, he replied. But sometimes we walk away together. A long silence passed, the kind that thickened, not emptied. Then she stood, slow and stiff, and stared out into the valley. They'll follow us. That preacher won't stop. He's the kind of man who needs to see the rope stretch. I know. We can't keep running. I know, he said again. She turned toward him. So what's the plan? There's a canyon pass, he said, rising. About a day's ride from here. 1 way in, 1 way out. We hold there. She narrowed her eyes. You think we can take them? No, he said. But I think we can make them think twice. She considered this. And if we die there? He stepped closer, voice quiet. Then at least it's on our feet. Her breath caught just for a moment. Not from fear, but from something harder to name. Resolve. Maybe even love, though she wouldn't let the word form. I've got 1 bullet left in my pistol, she said. I was saving it. For what? I didn't know. But now I'm thinking it might be for the preacher. He nodded. Make it count. She walked past him then, toward the horses, limping but unbroken. He watched her go. The fire behind him cast his shadow long across the rock, until it touched hers. As they packed the saddlebags, the sky began to lighten at the edges. Not yet morning, but close enough to hear it breathing. They mounted up and turned west, toward the pass, toward the uncertain battle ahead. Behind them, the wind stirred the ashes of the fire and carried the last of the warmth into the waiting dark. The canyon narrowed just as the gunslinger said it would, steep walls of red rock rising on both sides, stained by time and rain, the kind of place built for ambushes and final stands. No trees, no shelter, Just stone and silence and the echo of hooves. When they reached the narrowest point, the woman dismounted first. Her side throbbed, still tender, but the pain had settled into something manageable, something she could ride through, kill through if she had to. He followed her wordlessly, leading the horses behind a curve in the rock where they'd be hidden from the entrance. He took his time checking his revolvers, counting out what little ammunition they had left. 1 full reload, plus 2 rounds tucked into his boot. She climbed the ledge above them, slow and deliberate, and scanned the horizon through narrowed eyes. Distant shapes moved against the morning haze, figures on horseback. Maybe 10, maybe 12. One rode tall and straight, his coat like a white flag turned inside out. The preacher, no doubt. Still wearing his son's death-like armor, still convinced God was listening only to him. "They'll be here by midday," she said. He didn't answer, just looked up at her, expression unreadable, then returned to wrapping his shoulder with leather cord, tight enough to stop the tremor in his arm. The wound wasn't fresh, but the night's ride had worsened it. He wasn't at full strength, and they both knew it. "We set the charges here," he said, pointing to a rock fall above the trail. "Wait until they ride in, then trigger it. It won't kill them all, but it'll break their line." "I'll take the high ground," she said. "Cover from above." "You good on rounds?" 4 left. Then the knife. He gave a dry nod, the ghost of a smile flickering. "Always admired that about you." "What?" "You never needed permission to finish something." She crouched beside him, helping lace the last of the fuse. Their hands touched once, brief and unintentional, but they didn't flinch away, just looked at each other, and in that silence, something shifted. Not new, just fully uncovered. When the sun reached its peak, they were ready. The first rider crested the pass, rifle drawn. Behind him came the preacher, face tight with fury, mouth already shaping the sermon he'd prepared for the blood he meant to spill. He raised his hand, halting the group as they scanned the canyon walls. Then came the blast. The dynamite cracked the silence wide open, and a boulder slide roared down the cliffside, sending dust and screams through the pass. 3 horses fell. 1 man didn't rise. The others scrambled, drawing weapons, shouting orders. From her perch above, the woman took her shot slow and measured. 1 man tumbled from his saddle, hit before he could aim. Another caught a round to the thigh and crawled into shadow, bleeding and cursing. But her aim was tired now, hands shaking. She missed the 4th. Her revolver clicked empty. Below, the gunslinger stepped out from behind the rocks. Bold, deliberate. He fired 2 quick shots, clean, practiced, then took cover again. The preacher shouted his name, or maybe it was just a curse, lost in the thunder of gunfire. "You'll die for her," the preacher bellowed. "You'll rot for the devil's bride." "She's no one's bride," he shouted back. "But she sure as hell is mine to protect." More bullets sang past his ears, chiseling sparks from stone. He moved closer to the bottleneck, drawing fire away from her. One of the preacher's men tried to flank him. Too slow, too green. The gunslinger dropped him with a shot through the ribs. But he wasn't fast enough for the next one. A bullet caught him high in the chest, spun him to the ground. He rolled, gasping, blood already soaking his shirt. The canyon tilted around him. Time stretched. On the cliff above, she saw him fall. She didn't think, just ran. Down the incline, through dust and smoke, knife in hand. A man lunged for her. She drove the blade into his gut and kept moving. She reached the gunslinger as another figure stepped into view. The preacher, rifle aimed, lips curled in triumph. She dropped beside the wounded man, raised her pistol like it might still have a shot left in it, even though she knew it didn't. "Stop," the preacher ordered. "He's dead either way. Don't make it worse." "Funny," she said, standing to face him. "That's the exact thing I told your son." His eyes darkened. The rifle rose. Then a single shot echoed through the canyon. The preacher dropped. Behind him, Sheriff Dawson lowered his smoking revolver. The surviving men stared, stunned. Dawson stood tall, boots steady on blood-stained earth. "She's telling the truth," he said to them, voice hoarse. "I found the traitor. The Comanche girl. She lives." Her story matches hers. No one moved. This ain't justice, he continued. It's revenge. And I won't ride with men who can't tell the difference. The posse scattered slowly, some dropping weapons, others mounting up without a word. They left the canyon in silence, carrying their dead behind them. She dropped to her knees beside the gunslinger, pressing her hand to his chest. Blood, yes, but not as much as she feared. He blinked up at her, grimacing. You always that reckless? She laughed once, then bit her lip. Only when I've got something to lose. Dawson approached quietly, nodding to her. You two best ride west, he said. Far west. She looked up at him. Why are you helping? I spent a career upholding law. Maybe it's time I start upholding the right damn people. They buried the preacher under the rocks. No prayers. Just silence and wind. By nightfall, they were riding again. No words for a while. Just hoofbeats and stars. Then she said, You still planning on dying? He looked over, smiled with the corner of his mouth. Not today. Ahead, the land opened wide, untouched and waiting. Somewhere out there, a girl named Ahia was still alive. And now, maybe it was time to find her. Time to tell her the truth. That the woman who'd saved her hadn't just survived, but had chosen, at last, to live.